The Flashforge AD5X offers quality multicolour 3D printing at a surprisingly low price. It's compact, well built and packed with clever innovations, all from a manufacturer with years of experience. But is it as good as it sounds? Not so fast. During my extensive testing, I ran into some minor issues and one major deal breaker that might just put you off buying it. This video is sponsored by PCBWay. Before we dive in, I should just tell you that Flashforge did send me the AD5X for testing. I didn't buy it, but as with all my videos, nobody else has any influence over my content and nobody sees the video before it's released. If by the end of this video you decide this is the right 3D printer for you, check out the links in the description for the best deals I can get for you. So there's a lot to get through in this video, so let's just jump straight in. The AD5X is a Core XY multicolour printer. That means that this printer can change filament during a print, which allows you to print models in multiple different filaments. This can mean filaments with different colours or materials, which allows you to print things that you can't with a single filament 3D printer. Where the AD5X is different to most other multicolour printers is that it doesn't use a separate filament container or spool holder. Everything is mounted directly to the printer's frame, including all 4 filament spools. This was the first thing I noticed about this printer when I saw images of it, and it instantly struck me as one of those genius ideas that seems so obvious as soon as you've seen it. Why have a whole separate component taking up room and adding complexity and cost when you can just mount everything to the printer's frame? All of the filament control is handled by the Flashforge IFS module, which is a small unit that sits at the top of the frame and feeds the 4 different filaments directly to the extruder where they sit ready to be swapped out. The location of the IFS means that the PTFE feed tubes are shorter than on all of the other multi-filament printers, which could give this machine a major advantage over everything else. You see, up until now, the longer feed tubes on multi-material machines have meant that you can't push flexible filaments through as they would jam up. The shorter tubes on the AD5X offer less resistance and do very much allow flexible filaments to be printed through the IFS. Whilst this should mean multicolour flexible prints, and Flashforge did initially advertise this feature, unfortunately there seems to be some further challenges that can cause these prints to fail. Flashforge told me that there is still work to do to make these flexible multicolour prints work, and they've stopped advertising this as a feature for now until it's sorted. I did manage to complete automated filament changes with TPU, but I did also have multiple print failures when trying to print more complex models with flexible filament. While this is very hit and miss at the moment, if Flashforge manages to refine this feature and improve the hit rate, then it will have a major advantage over its competitors. Now, while I like the idea of multiple spool holders on the side of the printer, I'm not sure the actual implementation is 100% right yet. With the way the IFS needs to retract any filament back out of the hot end when changing to a different filament, ideally each spool needs to rewind a little to take up the slack. Each manufacturer has their own way of doing this, and I admire the way that Flashforge haven't just copied others, but I'm not sure their method is quite as good as, say, Bambu Labs' method with the AMS Lite. It's difficult to make a retractable spool holder that accepts all different sizes of filament spool, and not surprisingly, the Flashforge system works best with its own filament spools. Its new ones, that is, not the old ones. I found this out when I tried to use an older spool that is only fractionally smaller, but it's enough to cause a lot of resistance in the spool rotating. This not only might cause under extrusion for a print, but ultimately it's going to cause excessive wear on the components in the IFS and the print head extruder. The solution I found was pretty simple and involved removing the rubber pads on the top surface, which allowed everything to free up. I ended up removing all of them and I haven't felt the need to replace them. As you can probably imagine, there were some issues trying to use other types of spool too. Cardboard spools don't sit straight, and while I did manage to get a successful print using them, I can't help but feel that the whole spool holder has been over-engineered and we'd be better off with just a plain, non-movable shaft and have a bit of slack filament when the printer retracts. I'm clearly not the only one to think this, and there are printable replacements available if you want them. What I did like about the layout of the IFS and the fact that it accepts PTFE tubes is that I can feed filament from any type of filament dryer or dry box very easily, which isn't the case with other setups. Even though it kind of ruins the compactness of the AD5X, my favourite setup that I found myself using was feeding the 4 different inlets on the IFS directly from my Sunlu S4 filament dryer. This way I can keep the filament dry and even dry it while printing if I want to. The filament retraction also caused no problem with this setup either. The original setup does lend itself to some kind of enclosed filament dry box mod, so it wouldn't surprise me to see someone come up with something that is more compact. So let's just rewind a little bit and talk about setting everything up. As with a lot of core XY 3D printers, most of the assembly of the AD5X is done before the printer reaches you. However, there are a few more things that you need to do to attach the IFS. Nothing is particularly difficult, and it's all covered well in the supplied manual. You also need to attach the screen and remove bed securing screws, but once this is done, you're guided through the startup process on the screen. Just like other printers, you select your language and enter your Wi-Fi details, and then everything after that is handled pretty much automatically. Once a series of self-calibrations are complete, you load filament and you're ready to print. All in all, I'd say that the extra time it took to set up the AD5X compared to non-multi-filament printers was no more than 10 minutes. Building the AMS light units for my Bamboo Lab machines definitely took longer than this, so I'd say that this printer setup is quick. With 4 rolls of PLA loaded, I started with a simple poker chip, as it's a quick print using a couple of colours. This printed nicely with a really clean looking top surface. Unfortunately, as with any multi-filament 3D printer that only uses one hot end, like the AD5X, there is quite a lot of waste material or poop produced when the printer has to purge the previously used filament out of the hot end. This Flashforge printer is no worse than any other machine that uses the same method, but it's not better either. When you print small multicoloured items like this poker chip, then the waste seems excessive, but it's important to remember that there wouldn't be any more waste if you filled the bed with copies of the same print, as the printer would print all of the parts that need a certain filament before switching to another one. This just means that to minimise waste per print, you just need to think about things a little differently. If you want to skip the part sourcing scramble when it comes to PCB manufacture, PCBWay's turnkey assembly handles everything. Global component procurement, SMT and through-hole placement, including BGA and micro BGA, automatic optical inspection and final testing. Prototype runs start at just 5 boards, scaling up to thousands, with free stencils and detailed inspection reports included. Get fully assembled, ready to install PCBs delivered to your door by visiting PCBWay.com. Next up was a phone holder, again with a couple of colours and a good amount of surface details, which again is nice and clean. My next print was a banana holder, which used a bit more of the printer's build volume, which is a little limited. The bed on the AD5X is 220 by 220 millimeters, which used to be a very common bed size, as was the 220 millimeter print height that the AD5X can do. However, nowadays that's probably considered a little on the small side and is likely smaller than one of the alternative options you might be looking at. I did really like the colour of this yellow from Flashforge though, and after a bit of cleanup and assembly, the end result was what I wanted. After this, I started playing around with trying to produce some multicolour TPU prints, but as I said before, I wasn't really able to get the results I wanted. The AD5X will indeed feed at least Flashforge's own TPU through its IFS and prints very well with it. Anything more than a couple of filament changes though resulted in issues and clogs. The fact that it will do filament changes with TPU in some form or another shows that the hardware is capable of doing what we want, but it seems that maybe there's something in the firmware that needs some fine tuning to make the whole process more consistent. Fixing an extruder clog was quite involved, and it's not something you want to be doing regularly, but it did give me the opportunity to get a good look at the clever magnetic hot end cover that powers the part cooling fan through the magnetic connection, and the quick release hot end design on the AD5X. Unlike some of the others, Flashforge have separated the nozzle, heat block and throat from the heatsink, which should mean cheaper replacement hot end assemblies that would be needed if you want to use different size nozzles. With everything back together, I printed a single colour TPU ball, which, as you generally expect with flexible filaments like TPU, needed some cleanup when it came to unsupported overhangs. A few minutes work with my Metmo Multi-drive and a scalpel attachment though, and it looked more presentable. If you want to know more about the Metmo Multi-drive, you'll find a link in the video description. Metmo sent me the multi-drive to see what use it might have for 3D printing, and I've been giving them some feedback for how it might be improved. Metmo aren't your typical stack 'em high and sell 'em cheap kind of company and use high precision engineering in all of their products, so check them out if this sounds like something you might be interested in. After TPU, I printed some PETG brackets that I needed to help with some tiling. Unfortunately, the first try didn't go to plan, with the thin sections not staying attached to the bed, so I added a bit of bed adhesive to help out. With the added adhesive, everything went to plan and gave me what I needed. So, now that I'd seen what the AD5X could do and some of its limitations, I printed a selection of larger multicoloured models to see what else I could find. Now, you may be wondering about how I was preparing these models for printing with the AD5X and how I might be monitoring prints. Well, this, unfortunately, is where I was a bit disappointed with what I found. You see, rather than using one of the more popular 3D printer slicers, the software that you use to prepare prints, Flashforge have decided to create their own fork of Orca Slicer. This does mean that its Orca Flashforge slicer is easy to use if you're familiar with Orca, but it also means that you need yet another piece of software if you have multiple printers. Also, even though the AD5X has Wi-Fi capabilities, Flashforge have locked this connectivity down so that you can only remotely connect with your AD5X if you create and log in to a Flashforge account and bind your printer to that account. That means, as far as I can tell, that you need to log in to not only send files and monitor your prints through Flashforge's cloud service, but you need to log in for LAN access too. With all of the controversy around Bambu Labs' move towards restricting your use of third-party products with their printers, I know that this will be extremely unpopular with a large part of the community, and in my opinion, it's a terrible idea. Even when you do create and log into an account, the control you have is extremely basic. You can see and edit the filament loaded in the IFS, and you can see the nozzle and bed temperatures, but you can't edit them. And of course, because there's no camera, you can't see if the bed is clear before starting the print, and you can't see how the print is progressing remotely either. All of these things are possible with other printers that can be wirelessly controlled, so I don't feel like I'm asking a lot. All I found the device page in Orca Flashforge useful for was seeing how close a print was to finishing, or maybe for editing filament details that I'd forgotten to do when I loaded it. It also has a quirk where you can't send a print to the printer without selecting the correct filament that you plan to make it with. This means that even if your printer is on, after slicing a file you have to go to your printer and load the correct filament before coming back to your computer and sending your sliced file and starting a print. This is no big deal if your printer's in the same room, but mine are outside in my workshop, so trudging back and forward is annoying, and I might as well just put the sliced file on a USB stick and take it with me rather than using the remote printing feature. Even if you have loaded all of your filament ahead of time ready, unlike most multicolour printers that use Orca or Bambu Studio based slicers, you can't pull the filament details through to the prepare page so that you can select the right filament for each part of your print. No, with Orca Flashforge you have to edit the filament details manually while trying to remember what you have where. The Flashmaker app isn't much better either. You can at least change the printer temperatures in the app, but there's nothing else you can do with it other than see how much time your print is going to take. Considering how little you get from these Flashforge methods for controlling your printer and the fact that you have to create an account to use their cloud services, I'm not really sure it's worth it. I think maybe the better option would be to just use Orca and carry a USB stick back and forth like the old days. Whilst I and many others don't like all of these multiple different slicers like Orca Flashforge that are mainly rebadged versions of Orca or Bambu Studio, one benefit of the similarity is that you can take advantage of some of the print profiles now available online like Bambu Labs MakerWorld. What this means is that if you find a multicolour model on one of these sites, if you download the 3MF file instead of importing it into something like Bambu Studio, all of the colour change information will be downloaded too. When you open the 3MF file in any slicer from the same family like Orca Flashforge, all you have to do is change the printer back to your AD5X and then mess around with any filament colours until you get the look you want. This is the exact method I used to find things like the poker chip that I started with. The owl was a bought file from Cults 3D, but again, as the designer supplied a 3MF file that had been compiled with Bambu Studio, it had all the colour change information included. My favourite print with the AD5X has to be these little Drago Rexes from HOM 3D Lab, also from Colts 3D. I printed 4 of them to minimise the filament waste and chose for 3 of them to be printed without eyes. What you can then do is buy these really realistic looking eyes. I got these from Amazon and then you just stick them on. I'm not usually too fussed about models and toys, but I really like these and I have a couple of them on my desk keeping an eye on me, and the realistic eyes look great. Whilst I don't like the hoops you have to jump through for the limited remote control you get with the AD5X, there is a lot about the hardware that I do like. Whilst not the same, the frame and many of the components of the AD5X are very similar to a couple of previous Flashforge models. This means that the motion systems are tried and tested, but also that there are some areas where there is potential for upgrades. The AD5X isn't enclosed, but it will be easy to add side panels and a door, which I expect will be an option from Flashforge if you don't want to DIY it. Enclosing the top of the printer will be a different story though, and as yet, I believe not even Flashforge have figured out a way to do it. To be fair, the AD5X doesn't really need to be enclosed, as it's primarily focused on printing with PLA, PETG and TPU, which, as we've seen, it does quite well. Its hot end can reach 300 degrees though, which gets it near the range of filaments that would need an enclosure, so I'm not really sure if that maximum temperature will ever really get used. The bed can reach 110 degrees too, which is way more than you'd need for these simpler filaments. There are places for things like filters and fans that would be useless without an enclosure, so perhaps Flashforge are just saving money on making new panels when they already have ones from previous models like the Adventurer range. Unfortunately, despite the similarity and common use of some parts, the new IFS that allows multi-filament printing isn't backwards compatible with any other Flashforge model, which has left a lot of owners disappointed, as there was hope that these older models might have been able to accept the add-on unit. Without a camera or enclosure, it seems Flashforge felt an internal light would be a waste of money on the AD5X too, so there isn't one. What there is though is some sensible hardware that gives the AD5X its solid performance. Bed levelling is automated and triggered by load sensors, which have become the norm over the past year or so. What this also means is that you don't need to mess around with setting a Z offset, which is basically something we used to have to do to ensure that the nozzle was the correct distance from the bed when the print starts. Just like many newer printers now, the AD5X is very user friendly and you don't really need to know anything about how 3D printers work to get started. So my general overall impression of the Flashforge AD5X setup is that it's quite minimal, but the core hardware is good. However, there are a few other little niggles I've found that I should mention. Unlike printers like the exceptionally quiet Bamboo Lab A1, the AD5X does make a few squeaks and noises. Some of this was down to the rubber pads on the filament holders, but I also think some of it is down to the seeming lack of any kind of lubrication on any of the moving parts. The Z-axis lead screws are completely dry, which is very unusual, and it feels like the X and Y-axis linear rods could do with some kind of oil. I also found the screen to be a bit slow and unresponsive, which can be frustrating. I do like that when it's finished printing and it's cooled down, the AD5X goes completely silent with no fans running. As you can see, it's switched on now and it's not making any noise. I'm not sure if it's a firmware or hardware issue, but I did occasionally have some of the filament poop fall over the front of the wiper, which on one occasion actually caused the print to fail. Also, I do have a couple of gripes with the way everything is controlled by the firmware. Whilst we've already discussed some of the slicer integration and remote access limitations, there seem to be other control processes that are not quite right. The filament load and unload processes seem to do some weird stuff, and I resorted to just pulling the filament out by hand in the end, after having to interrupt what seemed like a never-ending loop of feeding and retracting by killing the power. TPU loading also seems less than perfect, which could be more down to me using filament that's a bit too soft to be fed down the tubes. So let's sum up with a few pros and cons. There is a pretty clear distinction here, with all of the major positives being hardware related and all of the negatives being software related. For instance, the AD5X is designed and put together very well, with some very clever ideas that you won't find on other machines. Well, until someone copies them anyway. I like the short filament tubes with the spools mounted on the side, which even gives you alternative feed options if you want them. I like the quick release hot end design and the choice not to try and save money on the parts that would affect the core function of a good 3D printer. I would like to see a camera and a light included, and I'd be happy to lose the overcomplicated spool holder to get them. All of my other negatives are around Flashforge's decision to keep everything so restricted when it comes to control. Your only real slicer option is Orca Flashforge, as even if you do choose to slice a print for the AD5X using a different slicer, there seems to be no way to get that slice file to your printer without going back to basics and manually transferring it on a USB stick. It's not a big problem at the moment, but what if Flashforge don't keep up with updates and bug fixes with their slicer? Will there come a day where they lose interest in the AD5X and we're left stuck with out-of-date software? There are also all of the other firmware niggles that I've mentioned, which on their own are not deal breakers, but they do just take the shine off the experience at times. The good news is that it seems that pretty much all of my negatives could be fixed with firmware upgrades and hopefully a cheap camera mod. If Flashforge do work to eradicate all of the little issues I've found, then I think the AD5X could be an absolute beast at a very low price. Is it worth buying right now though? I'll leave that decision up to you. Remember, there are links in the description to the best deals if you do decide to buy an AD5X, along with any coupons and discounts I can negotiate for you. If the AD5X isn't quite right for you, then check out this video for an alternative that might just be what you're looking for. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.